Director Kent talked about these 18,000 people. Can you give us an idea of who these people are, what type of threat they pose to us? We saw it wasn't some accident. This was an assassination and a murder. It was not an accident, despite my colleagues saying that it was an accident. It was a murder and an assassination of a National Guard hero. So what other types of threats are you tracking and preventing from happening?
Yeah, I would say, sir, that we face the terrorists that we've faced for years in ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Hamas, individuals that are here that are radicalized, but also we face the cartels as they've infiltrated our country under the last administration, their proliferation of human trafficking, drugs, and violence, going after Tren de Aragua as well, MS-13. Those individuals are still a very...
So you just watched it happen in real time, and I need you to understand the magnitude of what we're witnessing, because this is not some aberration or isolated incident, but rather the crystallization of decades of xenophobic manipulation, refined into its most potent and dangerous form, right before our eyes. And what makes this moment so infernally crucial is that the head of the National Counterterrorism Center told Congress on Thursday that the government has identified 18,000 known or suspected terrorists who reached the United States during the Biden administration. And you need to stop right there and think about that language, because known or suspected is doing absolutely Herculean ideological work in that sentence, carrying the weight of an entire fear infrastructure on its back. And here's where this gets absolutely explosive, because about 0.014% of migrants who had tried to cross the border in fiscal year 2024, or fewer than 2 out of every 10,000, were on the terrorist watch list, which means we're talking about a fraction so infinitesimally small that it would be laughable if it weren't being weaponized to justify the most sweeping authoritarian crackdown on immigrant communities in modern American history. And you heard Secretary Noem in that clip just now, doing exactly what this administration was designed to do, which is conflate everything into a seamless tapestry of brown and black threat, where ISIS bleeds into MS-13, bleeds into the cartels, bleeds into local gangs, until the categories themselves collapse into one undifferentiated mass of racialized danger. And this is not accidental, friends. This is the entire game, because here's what's coming, and I need you to be ready for it. 2,000 of the 18,000 known or suspected terrorists were let into the country as part of the Biden administration's program to bring Afghans to the United States following the botched troop withdrawal from the war-torn country. And when you unpack that statement, you realize we're talking about Afghan refugees, people who worked with American forces who were fleeing Taliban retribution. And the fact that they're being lumped into a terrorism statistic tells you everything about how this discourse functions, because the watch list itself is a Kafkaesque nightmare of algorithmic prejudice and guilt. By association, we're having a cousin who once attended a mosque where someone else knew someone who expressed sympathy for resistance movements, gets you flagged as a national security threat, and the entire apparatus exists to manufacture exactly these kinds of numbers that can be deployed in congressional hearings to terrify the public into accepting whatever draconian measures come next. In the last 48 years, going back to 1975, the number of Americans killed by a terrorist who crossed the southern border unlawfully is 0, and not a single American has been injured or killed by a terrorist who crossed our southern border without authorization. And I want you to sit with that statistic for a moment, because it completely obliterates the entire premise of this hearing and this clip and this manufactured crisis. But of course you didn't hear Representative Pfluger mention that, did you? Because facts are utterly irrelevant when you're engaged in the sacred project of stoking racial panic. And what you're watching in this exchange is the merger of two distinct but complementary streams of reactionary thought: the post-9/11 security state, with its surveillance apparatus and its suspension of civil liberties, and the pre-existing architecture of anti-immigrant white nationalism. Unauthorized immigration was reframed as a grave national security threat after the terrorist attacks on September 11, 2001, and since 9/11, national security has provided the primary justification for stringent immigration enforcement, which created this perfect storm where xenophobia could cloak itself in the language of counterterrorism, and suddenly the racism became respectable, became policy, became bipartisan consensus. You notice how Noem just seamlessly transitions from talking about ISIS and Al-Qaeda to discussing Tren de Aragua and MS-13, as if these are equivalent threats, as if a transnational terrorist organization with a sophisticated ideological apparatus is the same thing as street gangs that emerged from the wreckage of US-backed civil wars and destabilization campaigns in Central America. And this is the move. This is always the move to collapse all distinctions until immigrant equals gang member equals terrorist equals invader, and the solution is always more enforcement, more detention, more deportation, more death. But here's where this gets even more sinister, and I need you to understand the stakes because she defended her oversight of the president's mass deportation campaign, including signing off on sending more than 130 Venezuelan men to a Salvadoran mega prison this year, under the Alien Enemies Act. And when you invoke the Alien Enemies Act, which hasn't been used since World War II when it was deployed to intern Japanese Americans, you are reaching back into the absolute darkest chapters of American authoritarian history and saying, yes, that's the precedent we want to revive, and the fact that this is happening with bipartisan acquiescence with Democratic senators having voted to confirm Noem with barely a whimper of resistance tells you how thoroughly the Overton window has shifted on immigration discourse. And you heard Pfluger reference an assassination of a National Guard hero, and here's the manipulation because the top counter-terrorism official cited the Biden administration's admission of the Afghan man accused of shooting 2 National Guard soldiers in Washington, D.C., last month, killing one of them, and this is being used to paint all Afghan refugees, all asylum seekers, all border crossers as potential assassins, when in fact what this represents is the catastrophic failure of U.S. foreign policy, the 20-year occupation of Afghanistan, the complete abandonment of our allies when we withdrew, and now those same people are being scapegoated as terrorists because that's always easier than confronting our own culpability. And this brings us to the deeper structural analysis that has to be made here, because what you're witnessing is not actually about terrorism at all. It's about labor control and racial hierarchy maintenance. The data overwhelmingly supports a positive immigration story that directly debunks Republican disinformation. Because immigrants commit crimes at lower rates than native-born citizens, they contribute massively to economic growth, they revitalize communities, they pay taxes into systems they often cannot access, and none of that matters because the function of this rhetoric is not description, it's prescription. It's about constructing a permission structure for state violence. This is the idea that directly influenced the Pittsburgh Tree of Life synagogue shooter, the El Paso Walmart shooter, the Buffalo supermarket shooter, and it is the font of terrorism around the world, because when you hear Republican officials talking about invasions and infestations and terrorisms pouring across the border, you need to understand that this language has a body count, that it is directly linked to white supremacist mass violence, and that every single time a lawmaker gets up and repeats these talking points, they are potentially authoring the next manifesto for the next shooter. Now let's talk about what's actually happening on the ground, because this is the second-order effect that the Trump administration has deliberately engineered in lieu of its actual ability to carry out its designs to the hilt. After all, if Trump had one indisputable talent throughout his business and political careers, it's been a flair for the theatrically. And this is the key insight, that the terror is the point that even if ICE cannot actually deport millions of people, they can create such a climate of fear that entire neighborhoods shut down, that children stop going to school, that workers stop reporting labor violations, that victims of domestic violence stop seeking help, that the undocumented and the documented, and the citizens who happen to be brown or black or speak Spanish, modify their behavior out of sheer existential dread. This is governance through trauma. This is what Naomi Klein called the shock doctrine, applied to immigration policy, where crisis, both real and manufactured, becomes the justification for policies that would otherwise be unthinkable, and the genius of it, from a fascist perspective, is that it's self-perpetuating, because the more afraid people become, the more they retreat from public life, the more isolated, vulnerable they are, and the easier they are to target. And you have to connect this to the broader project of what this administration is attempting, because their language aims to stoke fear and test the boundaries of executive authority, and the orders cover a broad array of topics that aim to increase detention and deportation, restrict overall migration to the United States, punish sanctuary cities and states, and suspend access to humanitarian protection, and all include dehumanizing language and overly broad generalizations to justify novel uses of immigration authorities, the military amidst terrorism-related laws. So we're talking about the militarization of immigration enforcement, the use of terrorism statutes against migrants, the invocation of the Insurrection Act, the deployment of military forces for domestic immigration operations, and every single one of these represents a quantum leap in authoritarian power that will not be easily reversed once normalized. They attack the Biden administration for being lax on immigration, even as they cite a record number of arrests, detentions, and expulsions, and for those few who are not immediately detained or expelled, The GOP is working overtime to scare constituents into believing that there is a secret liberal plot led by President Biden involving migrants, and the most basic fact check exposes these nativist conspiracy theories as fictions. But we are long past the point where fact-checking matters, because we're operating in a purely effective register where feeling trumps fact, where the aesthetic of crisis supersedes the reality of policy. Here's what should be keeping you up at night, and I mean genuinely robbing you of sleep, because the numbers game that Pfluger and Noem are playing in this hearing is setting up the justification for something much darker that's coming, and you can see it in how they construct the threat matrix by saying the 18,000 number doesn't include the unknown number of terrorists the Biden administration allowed in after they crossed the border, and that doesn't include the individuals that came here illegally through the open border. That number alarmingly remains unknown at this time, which is philosophically fascinating in its circularity because you're being asked to be afraid of an unknowable number of people who may or may not exist, who may or may not have ties to groups that may or may not pose a threat, and the unfalsifiability of this claim is precisely what makes it so powerful as propaganda, because how do you disprove a negative? How do you demonstrate the absence of a threat that's been defined as invisible? This is the epistemology of fascism, where evidence becomes irrelevant, where the mere assertion of danger by authority figures is sufficient to justify any response, and where skepticism itself becomes treason. And let's be absolutely clear about what Noem is doing when she rattles off that list of threats, because negative mentions of immigration in right-wing media have averaged approximately 4,000 per month, and Republicans amplifying the dangerous invasion and replacement conspiracies in campaign messaging, despite these conspiracies' direct connection to multiple deadly domestic terrorist attacks. So we're talking about a coordinated media ecosystem where Fox News and Newsmax and OAN and right-wing podcasters and Republican officials are all singing from the same hymnal, all using the same language, all painting the same picture of civilizational threat, and this creates a self-reinforcing feedback loop where the rhetoric radicalizes the base, which pressures officials to adopt even more extreme positions, which generates more inflammatory rhetoric, and round we go spiraling towards something very dark. And the invocation of Hamas in Noem's list is particularly revealing, because what does Hamas have to do with the southern border? Absolutely nothing, but the name conjures images of October 7th and terrorism and anti-Semitism, and suddenly we're not talking about asylum seekers anymore, we're talking about potential pogromists. And this is how the discourse gets weaponized, how categories collapse, how fear metastasizes. What we need to understand with crystal clarity is that while terrorism watchlist hits have increased along the southern border, they still represent a very small fraction, fewer than 0.01% of the hundreds of thousands of migrants who cross into the U.S. illegally each year. And while Border Patrol apprehensions of individuals on the FBI terror watch list increased to 151 along the southern border in fiscal year 2023, the agency recorded over 2 million total encounters, which means we're talking about a rounding error being elevated to an existential crisis. And moreover, encounters of individuals with FBI terror database matches are much more common along the border. Separating the U.S., Canada, and Customs and Border Protection recorded more than 430 watchlist hits along the northern border in fiscal year 2023. But you notice we're not having hearings about the Canadian border. We're not deploying military forces to Buffalo, because the threat is not actually the threat. The threat is who gets to be American, who belongs, who can be expelled, and the answer, as always, is determined by the color line. This is racial capitalism in its purest form, where certain bodies are designated as surplus, as threatening, as disposable, and the entire apparatus of the state is mobilized to contain and remove them. And here's what's so particularly grotesque about this moment in history, because we have the receipts, we have the research, we know empirically. Some GOP officials are framing what should be a policy dispute about immigration in a way that hate movements have long claimed, and when migrants are described as invaders, that leads to violence, because how else does one stop an invasion? And this is not speculative. This is not theoretical. We have multiple mass casualty events directly linked to this rhetoric. We have manifestos that quote Republican talking points verbatim, and yet the response from party leadership is to double down, to intensify the language, to make the conspiracy theories more explicit. And this tells you everything you need to know about the cost-benefit analysis they've done, where the political utility of racial panic outweighs the lives lost to stochastic terrorism. And when Noem says these individuals are destroying families each and every day, there's a level of projection so severe, it borders on parody, because who is actually destroying families? It's ICE conducting raids at schools and hospitals, it's family separation, It's detention centers, where children are held in cages. It's the deportation of parents while their citizen children remain in the U.S. And this is the abuser's logic, where the victim is blamed for the violence inflicted upon them. What you're seeing in this clip is the normalization phase of something that historians will write about, and we need to be clear-eyed enough to name it as it's happening, because Republican colleagues are in full-blown election mode, turning to scare tactics and fear-mongering, and they entitled this hearing "A Threat to Every Community," a suggestion that those who are crossing our border are somehow all violent criminals, and suggesting that immigrants are some kind of threat to our society. Nonsense, and it only serves to further harmful and dangerous stereotypes. But this is the playbook, this is the strategy, and it's working. It's working because enough of the American public has been primed through decades of neoliberal immiseration to accept that their economic precarity, their social dislocation, their sense of loss is the fault of the people below them, rather than the people above them, and so the billionaires and the CEOs and the politicians who serve them can loot the country with impunity while directing rage downward toward the most vulnerable. This is class war masquerading as border security. This is the plutocracy defending itself by mobilizing white racial resentment, and the tragedy is how effective it is. How many people who should know better, who have themselves been exploited and discarded by this system, nonetheless sign up to be foot soldiers in someone else's oppression. And we have to talk about the specific invocation of the National Guard soldier, because this is grief being weaponized, this is tragedy being instrumentalized, and reports from the department's Inspector General identify gaps in screening from Customs and Border Protection, being unable to access biometric data from a Department of Defense watch list, to not having a dedicated procedure to screen asylum applicants whose cases drag on to obtaining but not sharing information from the FBI's Terrorist Screening Center, which resulted in the release of a migrant on the terrorist watch list. So when these rare failures occur, and they are vanishingly rare, it's not because the borders are open, it's because the massive bureaucratic apparatus that we've constructed has inevitable gaps and inefficiencies, and the solution to bureaucratic inefficiency is not mass deportation. It's better bureaucracy, but that's not politically useful. Is it because you can't run campaign ads on improving information sharing protocols between federal agencies? The emotional valence of "they killed our soldier" is infinitely more potent than "our screening procedures need better interagency coordination," and so the former gets amplified while the latter gets ignored, and another brick gets laid in the wall of the emerging police state. What we're watching is the Republican Party having gone fully mask-off on the Great Replacement theory, having decided that the electoral benefits of explicit white nationalism outweigh any reputational costs. Extremism researchers warn that rhetoric used by Republican office holders about the surge of migrants increasingly echoes the Great Replacement conspiracy theory that has inspired violence in the past and could do so again in the future. And this is the conspiracy theory that posits that there's a shadowy cabal deliberately importing non-white immigrants to replace white voters, and it's being articulated not by fringe figures, not by anonymous accounts on 4chan, but by the Speaker of the House, by committee chairs, by the Secretary of Homeland Security, on national television. Another version voiced by some high-ranking GOP officials asserts that Democrats are intentionally bringing in immigrants to dilute the strength of Republican voters, and this narrative has been articulated by now GOP House Speaker Mike Johnson. And when the conspiracy theories migrate from the margins to the mainstream, when they're being repeated by the third highest ranking official in government, you are witnessing not deviation but transformation, not aberration but evolution, and the fact that this is happening with relatively little pushback, with Democratic leadership having largely adopted the frame of the border as crisis rather than challenging it, fundamentally tells you how completely the discourse has shifted. Here's the thing that should terrify anyone with even a passing familiarity with history. Because we've seen this movie before, we know how it ends and what starts. With rhetoric about suspected terrorists always expands because the categories are infinitely elastic. Because once you've established the principle that certain people can be indefinitely detained, can be deported without due process, can be subjected to military tribunals, can be sent to offshore prisons, then the only question is where you draw the line, and lines can always be redrawn. Today it's people on a watch list. Tomorrow it's people from certain countries. Next week it's people who attended certain mosques or churches. Next month, it's people who belong to certain political organizations. And before you know it, you're living in a society where citizenship itself is contingent, where rights are privileges that can be revoked, where the law becomes a weapon rather than a shield. And this is not hyperbole. This is the documented trajectory of authoritarian states throughout the 20th century. And the genius of doing this under the banner of counterterrorism is that it comes pre-legitimated because we've already accepted that terrorism justifies extraordinary measures, that safety requires sacrifice, that freedom must be balanced against security. And once you've accepted that framework, you've already lost because the threat can always be inflated, the emergency can always be extended, and the measures can always be expanded. I need you to sit with the fundamental bad faith of what Pfluger is doing in this hearing, because he's asking Noem to describe the threat posed by these 18,000 people. And she responds by listing every possible category of threat from international terrorist organizations to domestic gangs, and nowhere in this exchange is there any attempt to quantify, to specify, to provide evidence for actual plots or attacks, because that's not the point. The point is the performance. The point is the spectacle of concern. The point is creating the clip that can be shared and amplified and used to justify whatever comes next. And what's coming is more raids, more detention centers, more family separations, more deaths in custody, more deputizing of local police, more surveillance, more militarization, and all of it will be justified by these 18,000 people, most of whom have committed no crime beyond seeking refuge, most of whom are themselves fleeing violence, most of whom represent no threat to anyone, but who have been transformed through the alchemy of propaganda into an invasion, into an infestation, into an existential threat to the Republic itself. The other dimension of this that demands analysis is how completely this discourse has become bipartisan in its fundamentals, because while Republicans are more explicit, more inflammatory, more openly racist, the basic frame that the border represents a crisis that needs to be solved through enforcement has been accepted by most Democrats and House Republicans' extreme approach to fixing the issues on the border are cruel, inhumane, and ineffective, and they have also shown no interest in working with the Biden administration to solve this problem, and time again, Republicans have ignored the Biden administration's request for resources to secure the border in a serious and responsible way. But the critique here is that Biden wanted more agents, more enforcement, more resources, not that the premise itself is wrong. And this is the trap that Democrats keep walking into, where they accept the Republican framing and then wonder why they can't win the argument, because once you've conceded that immigrants represent a security threat, the only debate is over tactics, over how much enforcement is enough, and the answer from the right will always be more, will always be insufficient, until every last person is deported, until the border is hermetically sealed, until America becomes the white ethnostate that's always been the animating vision of the restrictionist movement. And you heard Noem talking about how they've infiltrated our country under the last administration, and this language of infiltration is so saturated with Cold War paranoia, with images of sleeper cells and fifth columns, and it requires us to see immigrants not as human beings making rational decisions in response to violence and poverty, but as enemy combatants, as agents of a hostile power. And once you've made that cognitive leap, then anything becomes justifiable, then the camps become necessary, then family separations become reasonable, then the deaths in custody become acceptable collateral damage. This is the fundamental dehumanization that enables genocide, and I don't use that word lightly. I use it precisely because the logic on display in this hearing is the logic that has preceded every instance of mass atrocity in modern history, where a population is designated as threatening, as foreign, as less than human, and therefore as subject to forms of violence that would be unthinkable if directed at full citizens. And the incrementalism of it is the trap, because it's never the final solution right away. It's always one more necessary measure, one more reasonable precaution, one more temporary emergency power, and each step makes the next one easier, until you're living in a country you don't recognize under a government that has powers you never imagined granting. What makes this moment so uniquely dangerous is the convergence of multiple crises where the Republican Party has fully embraced authoritarian nationalism, where democratic institutions are weak and getting weaker, where economic inequality is at Gilded Age levels, where climate change has displaced millions, where geopolitical instability is rising, and into this volatile mixture you're pouring accelerant in the form of racist conspiracy theories about invasions and replacements and terrorism, and it doesn't take a particularly vivid imagination to see where this leads. Because when you have a political movement that has defined itself in opposition to democracy, that attempted a coup that continues to deny election results, that is systematically dismantling civil liberties, and you give that movement permission to round up and detain and deport millions of people using military force, if necessary, you are constructing the infrastructure of fascism. You are building the machine that will be turned on everyone eventually, because the logic of exclusion never stops with its first targets. It always expands, it always hungers for more. The final thing I'll say, and this is crucial, is that resistance is still possible, that none of this is inevitable, that there are millions of people across this country who see this for what it is, and are organizing, are resisting, are building networks of mutual aid and sanctuary and solidarity. That's what the bipartisan immigration bill sought to do before Trump ordered Republicans to tank it in an effort to benefit his 2024 campaign. Which tells you that even when solutions are possible, even when compromise is on the table, the crisis is more valuable than the solution, because the crisis serves the political project of reaction. But we can name that. We can expose that. We can build movements powerful enough to change the political calculus. And this requires us to reject the frame entirely, to refuse to accept that immigrants are the problem, to insist that a world where people can move freely, where borders are porous, where citizenship is expansive, is not only possible but necessary and desirable. We need to connect these struggles to see that the same forces criminalizing migrants are criminalizing protesters, are defunding schools, are privatizing public goods, are destroying the planet, and that our liberation is bound up together, that we build power by building coalitions across these struggles, rather than accepting the divisions that the ruling class creates to keep us fighting each other instead of fighting them. This is the work, this is the moment, and every single person watching this needs to decide which side of history they want to be on, because neutrality is not an option, not when fascism is advancing, not when people are dying, not when the stakes are this high. So the question is, what are you going to do about it?